May 2, 1945. Berlin. They found him. Hitler's body lay in the trench like a broken doll, bloody, disfigured by a gunshot to the forehead. The rumors were confirmed. He committed suicide. Soldiers were taking pictures near the deceased Fuhrer when screams were heard from the bunker. Soldiers discovered another body in the crater from the bomb blast. It was the partially burned body of Adolf Hitler. The German soldiers held in the bunker testified that they removed it from the Fuhrer's office and then incinerated it.
This discovery in the Soviet archives was kept secret for a long time. The Russian government only declassified this information in the year 2000. And besides, there's another amazing fact. Hitler's body was discovered in the Reich Chancellery on May 2, 1945. Which one was the actual Fuhrer, and was he even there?
Sensational details about the last days of Adolf Hitler's life. Who actually died in the Fuhrer's bunker on the day Berlin fell?
Genetic testing, however, revealed that it was not Hitler's blood.
Two dead Hitlers, and both are doubles. Unique account of a former Soviet photographer who personally saw copies of the Fuhrer.
Personally, I knew it was a setup. Of course, there were doubts, because anything could happen. After all, any kind of rumor could be spread, you know, about the fact that he shot himself and so on. However, I did not shoot him like Hitler himself. I filmed him as a double for Hitler.
Examination of Hitler's handwriting. The Fuhrer's confidential directives were signed by various individuals.
First, there was the actual Hitler, as seen in this photograph with his signature from the passport. But in the 42nd, 43rd, 44th, and beyond, it could be a different person.
Adolf Hitler's doubles, the Reich leader's top-secret weapon. They saved the Fuhrer from bullets and bombs, and with their assistance, Hitler executed his final grand performance, leaving the bodies of the doubles in the bunker to carry out an astonishing escape plan.
Historical records don't back the assertion that Hitler fled Berlin on April 20th, 1945. It's widely accepted that he perished in his Berlin bunker on April 30th, 1945.
Could Hitler have escaped from Berlin? If so, where did he flee to? We will conduct our own investigation. Let's try to decipher one of the 20th century's biggest mysteries, the puzzle of Adolf Hitler's death and last days. The year 1933. They navigated the extensive underground labyrinths, hardly breathing due to the tension. Their hands were trembling, their hearts were thumping with fear, and only one thought echoed in their minds. Survive, survive, at all costs. Now a daunting test awaited them. Only the finest, most precise duplicates of Adolf Hitler were to remain alive. His future deputy duplicates. For a long time, no one referred to them by their names, only by numbers. Their past didn't exist. It was erased. Now these people desired one thing, to emulate Hitler, so the lives of his lookalikes now depended on it.
This secret started to unfold due to the unique archives that surfaced in the late 90s in Switzerland. These are the interrogation records of SS Chief Heinrich Müller. As it turned out, he was secretly transported to the United States after the war. There, the prisoner disclosed the sensational fact that Hitler had doubles. Dozens were prepared, but only those personally approved by the Reich Chancellor survived.
It is common for politicians to have doubles. Stalin had such doppelgängers. Many prominent political figures likely had such doubles. After all, how does one ensure the safety of a head of state? The security service is tasked with this consideration.
Their eyes were blinded by a bright light. A short man entered the hall. The prisoners froze. He was just like Adolf Hitler. But this Hitler was indeed real. People became terrified. No one knew what to expect from this frightening, perilous man. He has already moved down the line here. There is intensity and hostility in his eyes. He carefully and meticulously examined each duplicate.
Numbers 247.
It was these 3 prisoners whom Hitler named who would remain alive. Others will be executed in the basement of the house. And numbers 2, 4, and 7 will begin a new life. From that point forward, they will become clones of Hitler. These doubles will start to stand in for him at parades and inconsequential meetings. They will be photographed in place of the Fuhrer, surrounded by children and workers. But the most important thing is that they will save Hitler's life.
Body doubles were not only used for protection. They stepped in for the actual person when their immediate presence was not necessary. For instance, during large public events, where the requirement was simply to appear, wave a hand, utter a few words, and depart. Or when there is a significant risk of an assassination attempt, that is, there is a direct threat to the individual.
The year is 1938, Munich. He was clutching his throat and convulsing. His pale, exhausted face was contorted with pain. The stunned officers could do nothing. They gathered in this beer hall to congratulate the Fuhrer on the successful launch of a grand military campaign. But instead of celebrating, they were forced to witness in horror as Hitler writhed in his death throes. He didn't even have time to utter a word. He drank some water, turned pale, and collapsed on the floor. And then he froze with a glassy-eyed stare. Panic erupted in the pub. The news of Hitler's death spread rapidly throughout Berlin. On the streets, in stores, and in bars, there was only one topic of conversation. The Fuhrer had been poisoned.
The second number has been deleted.
He couldn't recall how long he had been sitting motionless like this, with glassy eyes. Hitler did not show it, but the news of the double's death shocked him. In a few days, Hitler, alive and unscathed, will appear in a parade in Berlin. The panic over the Fuhrer's death will subside. Those who spread rumors about the death of the Reich Chancellor will be declared mentally unstable and sent to mental institutions for compulsory treatment. From that moment forward, no one would speculate about the miraculous resurrection of Hitler, who would increasingly utilize doubles henceforth. The year 1943, Zaporizhia, USSR. He shook hands and smiled at the enthusiastic cheers. Nazi soldiers were proud of their Fuhrer. He was fearless, even willing to fly to the front lines to personally boost the morale of the troops. Congratulations, cheers of joy. Hitler was not inclined to give speeches, but he enjoyed being photographed. He was already walking to his car when he heard a panicked whisper behind him. For a moment, it seemed to Hitler that someone was scrutinizing him closely. This feeling haunted him for a long time, ever since the day he first stared into the eyes of death. The year is 1933, Breslau, Poland. His back was aching, his hands were hurting, but Celeb did not stop working. He wanted to finish his work as soon as possible. Polish those large soldier boots and return home as soon as possible. His wife celebrated her birthday today. Celeb didn't have enough money to give her a beautiful gift. So he had to work overtime to afford a silk shawl from a shop that his wife admired so much. Finally, he put down the brush and reached for the iron coin. Celeb lifted his head and locked eyes with the German officer, and the hand holding the coin froze. The German could not take his eyes off Celeb. The awkward silence lingered. Suddenly, the German got up and forcefully grabbed Celeb by the shoulders. The silhouettes of several soldiers appeared from behind. In an instant, they grabbed him, and Celeb didn't even have time to comprehend how he ended up in the car. He fought, yelled, but it was all in vain. Somewhere behind, outside the window, his past life remained. Celeb believed that he would come back here, that it was all a misunderstanding, and that he would be set free soon. However, that day was the last time Celeb saw the streets of his native Poland.
The story of Hitler's most famous double involves a man named Celeb. It was Müller who mentioned that he had discovered this individual. He informed Hitler that there was such a person, strikingly similar to him. Despite the fact that Celeb had a completely different hairstyle, lacked a mustache, and was slightly heavier and shorter, Rattenhuber, the head of the Reich Chancellery's security and Hitler's bodyguard, began working with this double.
A small Catholic monastery is located in the town of Frontera, situated on the border between Germany and Poland. Externally, this building is indistinguishable from thousands of other churches. However, there were neither altars nor icons inside. No one had any idea that instead of cells, there were expansive rooms that precisely mirrored the layout of the Reich Chancellery, and instead of worship, clones were being produced there, specifically duplicates of the great Fuhrer.
The following days would be difficult for Celeb. He will be fed only once a day to help him lose weight. Only vegetables will be provided. He had to become a vegetarian. He will be taught to walk and talk differently. They will help him grow bushy antennae and create a new hairstyle. It will reach the point of absurdity. He will be taught to bite his nails. What is all this for? He will understand it when he sees himself in the mirror.
The biggest challenge was that Hitler was fundamentally a rather grandiose personality, which led to the following issue. Celeb's behavior needed to be made consistent with Hitler's. The same mannerisms, the same gestures, roughly the same pronunciation and diction. And Müller mentions that he had to work with this stand-in for almost 3 years, or even more.
The celebrity now stood in line with everyone else. Double of the Fuhrer number 4, a person who will either live or die in a few minutes. It depended on Hitler's decision. Celeb's heart was pounding wildly. With every step, Adolf was getting closer to him. He is already looking into Celeb's eyes, and this gaze made the Pole feel sick. A lump formed in his throat, and his arms and legs shook. He didn't dare to raise his head. Hitler did not consult anyone about anything, but for some reason, Celeb understood. There's a reason why this man is so meticulous in his choices. He will not point at everyone. And then he didn't even want to think about what would happen next.
Numbers 247.
These were the most beautiful words he had heard in years. They meant one thing: the Fuhrer favored him, which means he will survive. He will not meet the same fate as the others. Celeb could barely hold back his tears. He was both happy and unhappy at the same time. Yes, at this very moment, he had delayed his own death. But for how long, who knows? Suddenly, a panicked whisper was heard from behind. He looked around and wept.
For the sake of sacred Germany.
The last thing he saw was a bright flash, and then Caleb fell. When he regained consciousness, scared soldiers gathered around him. As it turned out, the bullet whizzed very close to the face. Another inch, and no one would have been able to help Celeb. Meanwhile, the guards were already apprehending the criminal. They did not know that they did not save Hitler at all. No one was aware of this at all, except for the Fuhrer himself and his inner circle, including SS Chief Heinrich Müller, who shared this story after the war.
Today, it is very challenging to determine how many body doubles Hitler had. 8 is the largest number that occurs. For instance, his maid mentioned that Hitler had doubles in several cities, specifically in places like Berlin, Munich, and others.
It was a brilliant strategy. Surround yourself with body doubles, let them risk their lives, thereby safeguarding the real Fuhrer. Hitler was victorious. He already considered himself invincible, believed that death would not touch him. And he made a mistake, because he completely overlooked the threat from his own associates. July 20th, 1944, Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg could barely control his wildly beating heart. At today's meeting, he was expected to present a report on the formation of new SS divisions. However, this did not concern the colonel in the slightest. He had been devising a plan to assassinate Hitler for 6 months, and now it was finally time to execute his plan.
Come on, we don't have much time.
The colonel was unaware of the existence of Fuhrer's doubles, so he didn't realize how fortunate he truly was. Beside him was a real tyrant. This meeting was very important, and the leader had to be there himself. Why would he need a stand-in here? Hitler trusted his entourage. Here, among the generals, he felt safe. But it turned out it was in vain. The colonel's hands were shaking, but Klaus did not hesitate. He bent down and put his briefcase under the table, exactly 2 meters from Hitler.
Excuse me, I have to go.
None of those present even had a hint that their death was lurking in the briefcase. It was a brilliant plan that was bound to work. One thing the colonel didn't realize was that destiny would disrupt his calculations. Just a few seconds before the explosion, one of the officers, oblivious to the danger, will shift Klaus's briefcase. The bomb will be on the other side of the table. At the moment of the explosion, a heavy oak shield will cover Hitler, thereby protecting him from the impact of the lethal wave. The Fuhrer will endure. However, the explosion will have severe consequences for Adolf. His face will be scorched in the fire. Due to damage to the eardrums, the Fuhrer will have impaired hearing, and due to a leg injury, he will limp for the rest of his life. However, there will also be quite peculiar consequences that Hitler's associates will not be able to explain. April 24, 1945, Berlin. General Weidling pleaded with the Fuhrer for forgiveness, to spare his life, not to execute him. Yes, he lost ground, fell back under the onslaught of the Red Army, but he will certainly rectify everything. May only Hitler spare him. He spoke and spoke, but the leader didn't seem to hear anything. Pale face, frozen expression. General Weidling would later describe this meeting in his memoirs. He will not only meticulously record the minute details of the conversation with the Fuhrer, but also remember his appearance. Hitler's pale, tired face showed no emotion. It seemed like nothing special, except for one significant detail. Weidling did not mention a single word about the burn on Hitler's face, which remained with him as a reminder of the explosion that occurred in the bunker. Weidling might not have been aware of these medical details from the Fuhrer's life. The general's attention was drawn to the leader's strange behavior. After some time, Hitler appeared to regain his senses.
Remind me of your last name.
The commander heard it, but it was hard to believe. Hitler could not have forgotten Weidling's name as he had an exceptional memory. Why did he ask?
So what's your last name?
The year is 1940. Poland, Auschwitz concentration camp. He looked at the people in uniform and trembled with his entire body, praying to God for just one thing, that these people would not discover him, would not spot him in the crowd. The famished and weary prisoners of Auschwitz only hoped for a miracle that would rescue them from certain death in the gas chamber. The soldiers called out names and forcibly dragged the frightened, exhausted people forward. They were sobbing, pleading for mercy, but the condemned were already being escorted to the barracks. And then his name was called once, and then again.
Klaus Buchter, please follow me.
He couldn't move. Klaus realized that he wasn't going to survive. He is Jewish, and the Nazis targeted them first. Buster had no idea that he was required for something completely different. A few years later, he would stand in a line alongside 9 other Hitlers, trying to muster all his willpower. But Buster was not good at it. Candidate number 7 was so nervous that you could hear his teeth chattering. For a year, the former concentration camp detainee was nourished and coached, and he proved to be a talented actor, but now he couldn't gather himself together. He knew that if Hitler discovered he was a Jew, it would be the end. Most likely, Buster will be sent back to the internment camp. Klaus shuddered. Suddenly, he heard a soft, muffled laugh. Buster looked up and met Hitler's gaze. The Fuhrer was amused by the scared, trembling prisoner who was chattering his teeth loudly and could not control himself. Klaus quickly looked down. The decision was made.
Numbers 2, 4, 7.
Klaus did not hold back. He fell to his knees and sobbed loudly. His frail, frayed nerves eventually failed. It was a bitter, regrettable victory. But it was the only chance to save my life.
So what's your last name?
Of course, Buster did not recognize General Weidling, as Buchter was a duplicate, the seventh double of Hitler. Unlike the actual Hitler, he couldn't recall the general's name because he had never met him in person, much like many other individuals he had to interact with since he started substituting for the Fuhrer at the battlefront. Weidling would write that on that day, Hitler not only refrained from executing him, but also appointed him as the General Commandant of Berlin. Weidling never learned that it was not the Fuhrer who spared his life that day.
It's fascinating, but it was the Jewish Klaus Buchter who replaced Hitler in the final days of the war. This information was first published in the American edition of National Police. The researchers then obtained unique extracts from the Gestapo file archives. Based on this information, the double of the number 7 regularly replaced the Fuhrer starting in March 1945.
This would seem incredible if it weren't for another substantial piece of evidence. According to the memories of Hitler's entourage, in the final months of the war, not only did Hitler's behavior change, but his handwriting did as well. His handwriting became illegible. We decided to conduct our own investigation, and for this, we consulted a graphologist. Alexander Farmagay has been studying people's handwriting for over 20 years and can readily identify not only an individual, but also their personality through their writing style.
Let's first comprehend the situation overall. These are all different handwriting styles, correct? And through handwriting, one can discern the personality and traits of the individual who is writing.
Of course.
Could you please tell me which elements of handwriting indicate certain traits of a person's personality?
Generally, one can identify dozens of different characteristics in handwriting, and a person involved in specialized or psychological analysis. And words, etc. Even aspects like margins while writing are taken into account.
So let's start our experiment.
Let's examine the handwriting of a specific individual. Before us is Adolf Hitler's handwriting, as though Adolf Hitler himself wrote it all. But can we assert here that it was written by different individuals? Can we identify such characteristics?
It could be argued that Hitler underwent personality changes throughout his life, and this was reflected in his signature. If you examine his signatures from, for instance, 1920 and 1940, you can assert that they belong to the same individual. However, if you scrutinize the signatures, Hitler's signatures from later years, such as 1942 and 1944, have several distinct characteristics that would be significant to forensic scientists who specialize in signature identification. This refers to a change in the direction of the signature itself and some elements of the signature. In earlier versions, the signature was more horizontal, and the final element in the signatures from 1942, 1944, and subsequent years is oriented more downwards. That is, initially there was the actual Hitler, whom we see here in a photograph along with a signature from his passport and, let's say, his signatures from 1920, 1923, 1934, and so forth. But in 1942, 1944, and thereafter, it could have been a different person.
It is surprising, but Hitler's handwriting from the 45th year is significantly different from the document signed by the Fuhrer earlier. Certainly, the physical injuries that Hitler sustained from the explosion in the bunker could have influenced his handwriting, but they could not have completely altered it. One could theorize that it was the Fuhrer's body double, not the Fuhrer himself, in the bunker when the war ended. But under such circumstances, what happened to the real Hitler? 1944, Berlin.
Leader Bormann, secretly, suggested redeployment across the ocean to the south later.
He was dictating this telegram, and his voice was trembling. After the bomb detonated in the bunker, Hitler lost control of himself. The fire disfigured his face, gave him no peace, and caused pain in his leg. The leader could not forget the events of that day. If not for a miraculous event, he would have died. This thought drove him mad. Hitler understood that he could not feel secure even among his closest associates. But where should one seek salvation? Germany actually lost the war. The soldiers of the once invincible army are retreating. Tanks with red stars will soon arrive in Berlin. He has to run away. But how? The leader knew he was being watched. All intelligence agencies around the world dream of capturing Hitler. To distract them, we need to make them believe that Hitler is in Berlin. But how is it done? Leave a tip? But they will quickly find out about it. No replica can fully replace Adolf. We had to do something urgently. And the leader finally made up his mind. After the fall of Berlin, Soviet troops discovered a telegram dictated by Hitler to Martin Bormann in the Reich Chancellery, but they kept this discovery secret for a long time. The Soviet intelligence reported multiple times. Since 1943, the SS has been devising a secret escape plan for Hitler.
This plan was called the Rat Line. The escape route consisted of a series of covert stops in Austria, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Argentina. However, did Hitler succeed in implementing this plan? Did the Fuhrer truly fool the entire world and evade punishment?
April 20th, 1945, Berlin. Hitler sat pale, immobile, like a wax figure. He didn't immediately notice the secretary entering the office. He did not hear the woman reporting about the generals who were waiting for the Fuhrer at the meeting. He turned his icy, glazed gaze towards the woman and suddenly seemed to regain his senses. Mrs. Junge screamed in terror as Hitler rushed to her aid. She could barely understand what the Fuhrer was talking about. It was unheard of, Hitler cried. He pleaded to be released or for the abuse to stop. Ms. Jung did not have time to listen to him. People rushed into the office. Among them was the Fuhrer's personal physician, Dr. Morell. Hitler was administered an injection, and he calmed down, becoming as placid as a wax doll once again. He behaved very oddly. It seemed as if he was a puppet being manipulated. This is how the secretary describes Adolf Hitler in her memoirs, but in reality, it was his seventh double. Klaus Buchter. It was an ingenious plan devised by Hitler himself, drugging his double, intentionally reducing him to a vegetative state. This is done to make him submissive and simultaneously convince his intelligence that the Fuhrer is now essentially a living corpse. After the explosion, he lost his sanity and fell into drug addiction, so that no one doubts that the leader of the Reich is in Berlin. He didn't flee. Sick and frail, Hitler stayed at his command post, preparing to perform a ritualistic sacrifice on the day Berlin was captured by ending his own life through suicide. The unconscious Buchter couldn't comprehend anything. He merely saw a flash before plunging into darkness. He was executed under the orders of SS Chief Heinrich Müller, then cremated and buried in such a manner that his remains would be easily discovered. The unfortunate lookalike was also unaware that the body of a deceased woman who was posthumously cast as Eva Braun would be placed beside him.
A detailed analysis of these remains also suggested that they were probably neither Hitler nor Eva Braun. The major issue was associated with the teeth of these corpses. Regarding Eva Braun, it's hard to believe that a woman like her didn't take care of her teeth, as the teeth of this deceased individual were far from perfect. Concerning Hitler, shortly before his death, he had ordered a dental bridge. Indeed, the discovered corpse did possess this dental bridge. However, it was not affixed, giving the impression that it was merely placed into the mouth of the corpse.
The Fuhrer's ingenious plan succeeded. When the Hamburg radio announced Hitler's suicide, no one had any doubts about its veracity. No one questioned why Hitler simultaneously bit into a cyanide capsule and shot himself in the temple. Why did he order to set himself on fire and bury himself in the ground? The entire world believed that Hitler died a soldier's death. He ordered his own body to be cremated so that he would not be ridiculed. No one suspected that it was a grand spectacle orchestrated by Hitler himself. It seems unbelievable, but researchers suggest that the Fuhrer could indeed have escaped from besieged Berlin. There is scant information about this, but there is some evidence.
More and more information is surfacing, suggesting that Hitler managed to escape and spent the remainder of his life in Argentina. The Eichmann family, who were essentially financial intermediaries for the Third Reich, provide the most convincing proof of Hitler's residence in Argentina. It was under the command of the Third Reich that massive construction was undertaken in Argentina, including airstrips, airfields for airplanes, and residential buildings for future settlers.
The soldiers of the Smersh battalion could not recuperate. Adolf Hitler is reported to have died in 2 different ways. But which one is true, and does it even matter? It will soon become clear that there isn't. We were able to locate a unique individual. During World War II, Boris Sokolov served as a military cameraman. And it was this individual who, in May 1945, personally witnessed and even photographed Hitler's doubles in the Berlin bunker. This man has agreed to grant us an exclusive interview to finally unveil the secret of Adolf Hitler's death.
What made me realize that it was Hitler's double, not Hitler himself, was that when we pulled back the blanket, he was still wearing his socks.
And I immediately thought that Hitler couldn't possibly be in patchwork socks. This must be his double, of course.
It was difficult to identify Hitler from the first burnt corpse. The second dead Fuhrer caused no less doubt.
He looked strikingly similar, this Hitler double, but his nose was broken at this spot, oddly pale, and there was a bullet hole in his forehead. Yet there was no blood, nothing at all. You know, his sideburns were identical, and his hair was styled in the same manner as Hitler's. On his chest was the Iron Cross ribbon, which he had been awarded during the First World War. He always wore that ribbon. In other words, they looked very similar.
Boris Sokolov maintains a unique photograph in his personal archive. Here he is, standing with his friends next to Hitler's dead body. For instance, we discovered a photograph of the actual Adolf Hitler and compared it with this picture. There are a lot of differences. It was these differences that were noticed by Soviet soldiers and photographers who were the first to see the bodies of several Nazi leaders.
I personally knew it was his doppelganger. Well, there might have been doubts. It could have been anything. Could have dispelled any rumors, you know, about the fact that he committed suicide or something else. Nevertheless, I photographed him not as Hitler, but as a Hitler's double.
Neither Hitler's dentist nor his otolaryngologist could identify the real Adolf Hitler among the two corpses. The names of the deceased are also disclosed. They are Buster, the Jew from Antwerp, number 7 in the Gestapo files, and Celeb, the Pole, number 4. The Soviet authorities classified these testimonies. They won't disclose any information about the first body found. The second one, which is burned, will be identified as Adolf Hitler. The only piece of evidence is a fragment of a skull that is still kept in the FSB archives. What happened to the actual Fuhrer? For many years, this remained a secret, but it was eventually disclosed by Heinrich Müller during interrogations in the United States.
Here is the document that Müller presented during the interrogation. According to this, on April 26, 1945, Hitler was allegedly supposed to escape to Barcelona via a high-speed plane. All of the leader's closest associates were to fly with him. However, it appears that at the last minute, Hitler crossed out several names, leaving only 10 people, including himself and Eva Braun, his longtime girlfriend, whom he had just married.
But where could they have gone? Researchers suggest several possible locations for the Fuhrer's relocation: Brazil, Antarctica, and most likely, Argentina.
There are numerous post-war photographs featuring Hitler. The families of those Argentine magnates, who had direct ties with the Nazis, simply preserve these as relics and do not display them to anyone. They even interviewed a housekeeper who had been employed at the family's estate for a considerable period. When shown a picture of Hitler, unaware of his true identity, she claimed to have seen that individual.
The Fuhrer implemented a brilliant plan. Survive at all costs, escape right under the noses of global intelligence. But did Hitler really succeed? There is no definitive answer yet. Currently, increasing evidence suggests that the Fuhrer managed to stage his own death as his final grand display and then disappear dramatically.
The entire country was mourning and kissing his portraits. On March the 9th, 1953, the Soviet Union was paying its last tribute to Joseph Stalin. On that day, hundreds of people were killed in the crowd, making their way to the deceased leader. And no one knew that the body in the coffin was not worth the sacrifice. The corpse wasn't that of Stalin. Sensational details of the death of the Kremlin's master. It is not Stalin who's been buried near the Kremlin Wall. The real leader had died before his official date of death. The secret life of the Soviet dictator. How many doubles did Joseph Stalin have? It seemed that Stalin visited different occasions with different ears. Who had prepared them and why? And what fate awaited the directors of this performance? People who were directly related to Stalin's doubles were shot. We will conduct our own investigation and find unique evidence. We will analyze the newsreels from those times. With the help of experts, we will determine how to distinguish the fake leader from the real one. If you take these two pictures, you can see that the ears belong to totally different people. And most importantly, we will find out what really happened to Joseph Stalin. December 31st, 1939. The Kremlin guards didn't like New Year celebrations because of the crowds that gathered outside the door. Suddenly, the crowd parted to allow the Kremlin master to make his way through. The usual slight smile on his face. The guards saluted. Everything went according to plan. Nobody could have guessed the surprise that awaited them. A moment later, through the same doors, another Stalin would enter. This incident is described in a book by a man named Sergei Krasikov, the guard who was on duty that night in the Kremlin. But what was it? A ghost or a hoax? That's how they tried to explain it to the frightened guard. Along with Comrade Stalin, there came a heavily made-up actor, Gelovani, to the Kremlin. However, the guards knew the actor was at least a head taller than Stalin. It turns out Stalin really did have doubles. But when exactly had they appeared? Ears are a unique part of the human body. People may be similar in many ways, but no two pairs of ears are alike. It is on this basis we'll try to find out the truth. Here are some pictures of the leader. They were taken over the period of a year, but in different places. We will show these pictures to a specialist. Ukrainian expert criminologist Andrei Dubovik has agreed to help us by examining 6 different portraits of Joseph Stalin. Right now, he will determine how similar they are. Auricle, retina, and fingerprints are totally unique features that can never be repeated. Visually, you can determine if a person is very similar. The eyes, nose, or ears. But somewhere there will be a difference. So we are starting the experiment. Andrei takes photos and examines them. The first conclusions of the expert are really amazing. Here on this photo, we can see the ear of the owner, regular oval shape. If we look at another picture, here the ear is completely stretched out in an elongated shape, completely different. You can clearly see it when we zoom in on the photo. The ears belong to totally different people. This is surprising, but it turns out that in these particular photographs, there are 2 completely different people. According to experts, this is the first time the double rather than the leader was captured on newsreel. This is the parade of 1935, which was led not by Stalin, but by his double. Documents confirm that Stalin had doubles. This is completely accurate. Anyway, with the help of documents, I can confirm in a few minutes that there were such people. But why did Stalin need doubles? 1933, Abkhazia, Lake Ritsa. Stalin was having a rest. He always liked water trips. He also liked this quiet and unobtrusive Mingrelian who accompanied him everywhere. deputy head of the Georgian NKVD, Lavrenti Beria, always subtly felt Stalin's mood. Not wanting to disturb the leader's thoughts, he stood aside. The boat was slowly approaching a wooded bank. But suddenly, something unbelievable happened. Suddenly, a body fell on top of Stalin. It was Beria who shielded the leader from fatal bullets. Who was shooting? The trembling Stalin didn't even think about it. He was too afraid to move. He could only think of one thing. If it hadn't been for Beria, he would be lying dead in the boat. But Stalin didn't realize that Beria himself had organized the attempted murder. It was just a show for one spectator, but with very clear goals. So with this attempted murder, Beria killed two birds with one stone. After the incident, he became a trusted associate of Stalin, and more importantly, he managed to convince the leader that from that moment on, his life was in constant danger. And only he, Beria, knew best how to protect the Kremlin master. Stalin was encouraged by Beria to create doubles as a form of protection for himself. A provocation was organized by Beria. It seemed to be an attack on Stalin. Beria needs to scare Stalin, make him believe that there were constant enemies who must be destroyed. 1934, suburbs of Moscow. For the third hour, Christopher was lying lost in conjectures. Who are these people that took him away in the middle of the working day? Put him in a car and took him somewhere. What did he do wrong? What did they want from him? People silently checked his eyes with a light and felt his chin. They sprinkled his face with something. Christopher felt unbearable pain. It felt as though his skin was burning. Now he had the same smallpox scars as his leader. He woke up in unbearable pain. His face was burning. What did they do to him? He was even more shocked when he looked in the mirror. Looking back at him was Joseph Stalin. Only the man's scared eyes were different from Stalin's. A few hours later, a nurse came to the ward to check Christopher's condition, but he did not react. He could only think of one thing: to escape, to save himself, and forget the terrible nightmare. Suddenly, it dawned upon him. He threw himself at the girl's feet and asked her to send a note to inform his family about where he was and what had happened to him. Christopher did not realize his family were already dead. And no one could help him. Your name? Christopher. His old life had ended, and a new one had started. Your name? Christopher. Full of humiliation and fear. He had to learn how to talk and walk and smoke a pipe and keep his left arm motionless. In this studio was a special director who taught him Stalin's intonations, gestures. This was obligatory. There was a director, perhaps not the only one, who could teach gestures, voice, intonation and behavior, the way he holds his hands and so on. Soon he was standing on the mausoleum, greeting demonstrations and parades. As far as his colleagues were concerned, this man died in a car accident along with all his family. His name disappeared from all documents for good. As with the documents, went his entire existence. However, the truth would still come out. The directors of the show had made a huge mistake. Outsiders learned about the existence of Stalin No. 2. In the Politburo, rumors were being spread. The leader had been replaced. Gossips were soon arrested. However, the truth came out. Many years later, this story was described in a book by Stalin's former bodyguard, Sergei Krasikov. He even mentioned the full name of the double. Christopher Goldschtab. Christopher, who would soon become well known. On December 6, 1934, Moscow was paying its last respects to the first secretary of the Leningrad Regional Party Committee and Stalin's favorite, Sergei Kirov. Here's a video. We can clearly see in the newsreel, along with Molotov and Budyonny, the coffin is being followed by the leader himself, or so everybody thought. And only a few knew. In fact, it was the debut of Stalin's new double, Christopher Goldschtab. Behind the coffin walked a silent man. In mine and other historians' opinion, this was Stalin's first double, the silent one. He had a lot of silent doubles, unlike Stalin himself. 1935, suburbs of Moscow. Yevsey felt he was in seventh heaven. A simple accountant from Vinnytsia Oblast, he had dreamt of becoming an actor since his childhood. And now it seemed his dream was coming true. For the last 6 months, he worked with a whole crew of doctors, cosmetologists, directors and actors. They only wanted one thing from him, to impersonate Joseph Stalin. And here he triumphed. He has become a true replica of the leader. The door opened. The main performer had arrived. A short man in a pince nez. The man who had brought Yevsey here. Lubitsky's heart started to beat loudly. The snake-like look of Comrade Beria seemed to penetrate him. But the double coped and didn't look away. Now remained the most important thing of all, to please Comrade Stalin. It was the rule. The master of the country always checked his doubles personally. An hour later, they had to meet in the Kremlin. The former accountant was feeling confident. People who were directly related to Stalin's doubles were shot so as not to leave any trace. Beria knew how to cover his tracks. Therefore, he sentenced to death all the performers of the double's transformation and to kill Lubitsky's family to keep it secret. Yevsey himself survived. In the 80s, he told his story to a Montreal newspaper. But to survive, he needed a miracle. Stalin was examining the double with contempt. although they were identical, the leader could not deal with his background. This man was a Jew, and the ambitious Stalin could not stand it. It seemed that the decision had already been made. Let Beria liquidate this material. At first, Stalin didn't notice little Svetlana entering the room. She threw herself into the arms of the leader. A moment later, she saw her real father. It was a triumph. And Yevsey realized he had been approved and would therefore live. He interviewed some of the doubles. He had the power to say yes or no. And he loved his Lubitsky. He was a gentle, quiet man. Stalin was right. Lubitsky was a really talented actor. While Golshtab stood in the distance on the mausoleum, Lubitsky met with ambassadors and even members of the Kremlin. It entertained Stalin. He even watched these meetings through a special lens. Most of all, he enjoyed it when his subordinates abased themselves in front of his double. It made him feel euphoric. However, this was merely entertainment. The true role of Stalin's doubles remained the same. They were targets. Watch later. Amazing details of the leader's death. The real Joseph Stalin was killed a month before the official date of his death. And for a few weeks, the country was ruled by his double. Unique evidence of Soviet medics. At the Kremlin Wall is buried a copy of the leader. The last mystery of Lavrenti Beria. Former head of the NKVD was shot on the day of his arrest in his private cabinet. The inquiry over Beria's double lasted 6 months. November the 6th, 1942. Moscow. The guards were tense. A car approached the front door of the Kremlin. A moment later, the master got into it. The car hadn't even made it through the gate when shots were heard. Terrified guards rushed to rescue the leader. But when they saw him, they were shocked. Stalin was covered in blood, with no signs of life. This was described by several security guards. But how surprised they must have been when the next morning they saw Stalin alive and well again. He came out of the Kremlin as if nothing had happened. But how did he manage to survive? It was a well-organized system. Every time a double came out of the front door and got into a car, Stalin would leave from the back door and drive in a different direction. This scheme never failed. On the day of the attack on the double, they managed to warn Stalin of the danger, and he simply did not leave the Kremlin. The leader appeared in front of the guards the following morning. In order to explain his remarkable recovery, he ordered a statement claiming no one died in the attack. Stalin standing on the mausoleum, Stalin in a car on the street, Stalin in the crowd. In the midst of the war, he appeared everywhere, as if signaling the leader is with his people. When they began comparing all the portraits and photographs, it appeared that Stalin had
Different ears?
This suggested that Stalin did indeed have doubles. And it was they who were hunted by the German intelligence, the Japanese Secret Service, and the saboteurs. The KGB had been instructed to look for people similar to Stalin. They say there were 14 doubles. The system worked perfectly. During the war, there were more than 20 attempted murders. How many of them succeeded remains a mystery. But one thing is sure, the real leader survived them all. Stalin appreciated Beria's idea. The doubles were being looked for throughout the entire country, in factories and villages, but mostly on the front line. Relatives were sent a killed in battle notice. They were none the wiser and had no idea that their relative had begun a completely new and different life. Each of them had to learn how to move, behave, or even talk like Stalin. Although the lookalikes were allowed to look people in the eye and shake hands, under no circumstances were they to make speeches. And the doubles performed their roles perfectly. They were masters at parades and dinners. And they would even sit in at meetings of the Politburo when Stalin was ill. The quote from the history of Stalin's illness, 1947, quote, "The beginning, March 26, Joseph Stalin has got diarrhea. By the evening, he felt feverish. He feels generally indisposed. At 7, the temperature was 38.5 degrees. You may ask, but what does this have to do with Stalin's doubles? The answer is simple. Meanwhile, according to all the world newspapers, Stalin welcomes delegations, sits at the largest meetings. Beria, Malenkov, Voroshilov are sitting on the panel in the foreground. But for some reason, he is behind. Because it is a double, and he isn't allowed to listen to what the first people in the country say. However, there were some incidents. It was at the time of Stalin's illness when a delegation from the United States arrived in Moscow. It was too late to cancel it. If the leader hadn't shown up, it would have been disrespectful to the foreign guests. But Stalin, who at that time was lying in bed with high fever, could not come. The leader was promised that it would be merely a ceremonial meeting, and Stalin decided to take a risk and send his double. Stalin had said things that the Americans simply had to publish and say that it was not clear how to explain this to the people. Our side had no choice but to publish their own version of this meeting and say that the Americans didn't understand it correctly. Stalin was speaking in Russian, so they couldn't understand and translate everything. It was a double. No matter how hard this double tried, he said something wrong. But even after that incident, the leader had retained the services of his doubles. They were a perfect weapon that saved him from death and were helpful during any illness. But there was one thing Stalin had overlooked. Very soon, this weapon would shoot back at him, and the trigger would be pulled by a man who once had raised the cock. March 1st, 1953. Suburbs of Moscow. That night, there were guests at the dacha. The leader's closest and most trusted circle. Beria, Malenkov, Bulganin, and Khrushchev. For a long time, they sat talking about business. They dispersed at 5 in the morning. The guards felt relieved. Now they could rest. However, they knew that no matter how long a party continued, at 8 a.m., Stalin would already be on his feet. But this morning was different. At 9 a.m., he was still in his bedroom. Maybe Stalin had decided to have a lie-in. By 10 a.m., the guards were beginning to worry. Maybe something had happened. But how to check? How to enter the room? The door to the leader's room is a no-go area for outsiders. Anyone who opened it at the wrong time risked their life. Only after a specific sound could a person enter. Half an hour later, mail was delivered. The package was to be immediately given to Stalin. Who was to hand it over? It was decided that the job should go to Deputy Superintendent Pyotr Lozgachev. Stalin liked him. There was a chance that the man would not be punished. Lozgachev quietly opened the door. Stalin was not moving. A moment later, the house was in turmoil. They called the Kremlin. Stalin was put in bed and covered up. But then, strange things started to happen. According to Nikita Khrushchev, they were informed of Stalin's strange disease on March the 2nd at 9 a.m. He and Beria came to the dacha and called the doctors. They didn't leave the leader for a moment. But Lozgachev assures us that everything happened in a completely different way, and Stalin was found a day earlier. Beria allowed doctors to enter the house the next morning. X-ray, cardiogram, injections. All were made quickly and accurately. Procedures were recorded in a book, as well as a description of the patient, including any bruises and scratches. Did these people know that soon they would cause a revolution? They were about to discover that it was not Stalin whom they had treated. Record book of Stalin's doctors. For many years, this document was kept in the archives as classified information. But now it became available and totally changed the idea of the last days of Stalin. Medics recorded everything, even the appearance of their patient. And it turns out that this patient was not Stalin, but his double. The true leader of the Soviet Union had many physical defects. The second and third toes on his left foot were fused at birth. Leg muscles were of different thicknesses. His left hand was paralyzed, which is why he always kept it bent or hidden behind his back. But they found no such defects on the patient who died in the dacha. It's incredible, but according to the records, the patient had a completely normal body structure. On his feet, the big toenail is not cut. Nothing about the fused toes. Nothing about deformed hand during the autopsy. They described a completely different body, which indicates that it must have been a double. Thus, it wasn't Stalin, but a double. The man who replaced the leader on his deathbed. But what happened to the real Stalin? It's hard to believe, but experts say the leader died a month before his official date of death. And it was the head of Cheka, Lavrenti Beria, who took care of this. And where was the real Stalin? I do not know what Beria could have done with him, but one day he proudly announced, "I removed him." But how could this happen? What made Beria take this step? As it turned out, it was Stalin himself. The leader was afraid of power and authority which the former Cheka officer had. Beria was becoming too dangerous, and Stalin decided to act. The leader ordered to collect compromising material on him, which over time could be used in court. This decision became fatal for the leader. Beria realized he could wait no longer. We have found evidence from Stalin's daughter Svetlana Alliluyeva. Here is what she wrote about the last few weeks of the leader's life. "My father has changed a lot. Usually he is pale. Now he has a red face. He is not talking to me, and it seems doesn't even know. What does this strange evidence mean?" Can it be that Svetlana Alliluyeva was describing her father's double? Where then has the real Stalin gone? Experts suggest Beria had got rid of the leader earlier and replaced the dead Stalin with a fake. It was a triumph. Now the double was Beria's puppet, and he could not stop him on his way to limitless power. But Beria overlooked one thing. Stalin's closest circle, Khrushchev and Malenkov, had already prepared a plan to assassinate the leader. They didn't know about the substitution. Therefore, Beria was accused of being an accomplice or an enemy. Beria could not risk his life when his dream was so close. And the former head of the Cheka could do nothing but kill Stalin for the second time. On March the 5th, 1953, in Moscow, an important event took place. Joint meeting of the Politburo, the government of the Soviet Union, and the Supreme Soviet. By a unanimous vote, Comrade Beria was given full power. The other members of the Four hadn't been forgotten. All of them got key positions. Exactly 1 hour after the meeting, the death of Joseph Stalin was announced. Beria was jubilant. His plan had worked. He managed to fool everyone, including Stalin and his former associates. The way to the throne was free. But one thing he didn't realize: not everyone would accept his plans. Former friends did not want to obey Beria. They knew that after his rise to power, things would be even worse than under Stalin's reign, and they already knew what to do. To use the same simple and reliable method: the doubles. The gun that had killed Stalin now had to be used against Beria. June 26, 1953, Moscow. He was sitting in his cabinet, carefully looking at some papers. Beria was preparing for the next meeting of the Politburo, when the doors of his cabinet opened. In walked some military men armed with weapons. Beria rushed to the briefcase, where there was a loaded pistol. But he had no time to do anything. For the next 6 months, a prison cell deep underground in a bomb shelter would become his home. And his daily duties would include attending the court hearings. Beria would be tried as a traitor to the state, a murderer and a pervert. They would remember everything: mass executions and child rape. In 1953, the entire country would learn of his crimes. However, they weren't allowed to see the criminal. The process would take place behind closed doors. But why? because it was only a show, hastily prepared and not of high quality. November 1953. Moscow. On that day, as was traditional at the Kremlin, they were listening to the radio. From there, they heard voices of prosecutors and plenty of charges. Scandalous details of the life of the most influential man of the Union. And now, a simple defendant, Lavrenti Beria. But one thing surprised the Kremlin staff. Why were only a few allowed to witness the process? Why wasn't he being photographed? Soon, all the Kremlin would be gossiping about it. Defendant Lavrenti Beria would turn out not to be Lavrenti Beria at all. It happened at one of the hearings. On that day, they decided to question the witness, a man whose wife Beria had raped and murdered. The witness was a Mingrelian, that is, he belonged to the same nation as Beria. In anger, he suddenly spoke to the prisoner in his native language. He asked in Mingrelian if the murderer liked feeling powerless. But Beria did not understand a word and remained silent. Has Lavrenti Beria forgotten his native language? Or was that not him behind the prisoner's box? The latter could explain a lot. Why the process was closed and why photographers were not allowed in. A double prepared in haste could easily be exposed, but the organizers of this show couldn't afford for it to fail. Beria did not know that while he was making plans to become leader of the country, Malenkov and Khrushchev were already preparing a double who was to replace the original at a fake hearing. Because no one was going to judge real Beria, they dealt with him as fast as with Stalin. The murder of Beria was organized like this. The Presidium of the CC was informed that there was data incriminating Beria in the organization of armed conspiracy, armed seizure. They would therefore invite Beria to the Presidium and ask him what was going on. But what if Beria refused to come to the Presidium? Khrushchev offers to send 2 generals to bring Beria to the Presidium. When the generals returned, they said that Beria had resisted and had therefore been killed. They lied and declared that Beria had been arrested and that an investigation was underway, but Beria had been killed. Exactly 6 months later, in the chambers of the Lubyanka, his double was shot. With the official death of Beria began the era of the new masters of the Kremlin. Khrushchev, Brezhnev and Andropov. Who was pounding his desk with a shoe at the UN meeting, threatening the Americans with Kuzkina mother? Khrushchev or his badly trained double? How had Brezhnev survived 9 attempted murders? Or could it have been the service of the doubles? Who has been appearing before us on TV, welcoming parades and ruling the state? Today, no one can be sure. The documents of that era are still kept in the archives as top secret. And along with them, the sensational facts about our modern history.